when they passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. And Paul went in, as was his custom. And on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead. And saying, "This Jesus, whom I proclaim to you, is the Christ." And some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a great many of the devout Greeks, and not a few of the leading women. But the Jews were jealous, and taking some wicked men of the rabble, they formed a mob, set the city in an uproar, and attacked the house of Jason, seeking to bring them out to the crowd. And when they could not find them, they dragged Jason and some of the brothers before the city authorities, shouting, "These men, who have turned the world upside down, have come here also, and Jason has received them. And they are all acting against the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, Jesus." And the people and the city authorities were disturbed. And when they heard these things, and when they had taken money as security from Jason and the rest, they let them go.
This is not abnormal in the history of the church. They go to a city, they witness, they evangelize, they're kicked out. But we're going to find out as we go through the rest of our text is that they just go to another city. They're relentless in their proclamation of Jesus. Things did not change. The early church continued to be relentless in its proclamation to Jesus, about Jesus, to the world. And in fact, it became rather annoying to their Greco-Roman neighbors, disturbing the peace, telling them they were wrong. And in 177, in the summer of 177, so this would be little more than 100 years after the book of Acts account that we're reading, so about a century and some later, there's an account by Eusebius in his church history that I'm going to scan through to give you an idea of pagan reactions to these Christians who were relentless. It took place in South France, and this is actually from one of the survivors of the eyewitness accounts of this persecution that broke out in this city, in the area that was then called Gaul, is in a city called Lyons, which is still around today in South France. They endured nobly the injuries heaped upon them by the populace, clamors and blows and draggings and robberies and stonings and imprisonments and all things which an infuriated mob delight in inflicting on enemies. So this actually is a mob action. It didn't actually begin with the government. Similar to this story, it began with the populace. Some of this is graphic, but please, let's read it. Blandina is one lady identified. And there is 2 torturers who took turns torturing her day and night, morning till evening. And they were amazed, even though she was mangled and broken, the account says. All she would keep on saying is, "I am a Christian and there is nothing vile done by us." Still proclaiming. Sanctus. They would interrogate him. "What do you guys do? What are you up to?" And all he would say, he wouldn't even give him his name. And just in Latin, all he would say is, "I am a Christian." He confessed this instead of name and city and race and everything besides, and the people heard from him no other word. What they were looking for was recant. If you would recant, they would not kill you. It was really that easy. So they became annoyed with his patience. So I'm going to quote from the account of what they did to Sanctus. They finally fastened red-hot brazen plates to the most tender parts of his body, and these indeed were burned. But he continued unbending and unyielding, firm in his confession, and refreshed and strengthened by the heavenly fountain of the water of life. They kept on torturing Sanctus, and in fact continued on again the next day. There's another man named Maturus. They put him through every torment. They put him in the amphitheater, and here's what it says about him. Endured again the customary running of the gauntlet and the violence of the wild beasts. At last the iron chair on which their bodies being roasted tormented them with the fumes. And this account goes on and on like this. But at the end of one of the sections, the eyewitness says this, By their patience, the measureless compassion of Christ was manifested. For through their continued life, the dead were made alive, and through their influence, many who had denied were restored and learned to confess. What he's saying is that people who did recant, who said, okay, I'm no longer a Christian, after seeing what the martyrs went through, they came back to the governor, asked to be retried, and were retried, and then, as the account says, joined the order of the martyrs. The word martyr is actually grammatically closely tied to the word for witness. They're essentially the same word. That means in the early church, the idea of martyr originally just meant the word witness. To be witness, in essence, was to be martyred. The relentless church, even while enduring persecution, proclaiming Jesus Christ and his lordship. Now we flip back to our account in Acts chapter 17, and we look and we see the beginning of this type of thing. If you could go to this slide, click down all of them. Here's the things we're going to see of what the relentless church is. It's going to be 6 points, and I'm just going to repeat them in every passage so you'll have time to see these. What is the relentless church? What does it look like? It's an intentional church. It's a biblical church. It's a persuasive church. It's a diverse church, a rebellious church, and a Jesus-focused church. All those we're going to see in every account in some way or another. So let's look at our first account. Acts chapter 17, 1 through 9. Each of these we'll pull out and see. Intentional church. Now when they had passed through, names 2 cities, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. Now watch this wording carefully in verse 2. Paul went in as was his custom. Custom is something you do regularly, like a habit. Paul had a habit of going into the synagogue to witness to Jews from the Hebrew Scriptures about who Jesus was. And look at this, he's regular in it as well. On 3 Sabbath days. So he stayed in the synagogue, coming back every Saturday, witnessing to them. 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the Scriptures. So you see, he's very intentional. And think about how rude this is. Going into someone's place of worship, saying, your whole setup is wrong. You've got part of the answer. Let me open it up from the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, and show you the truth that you're missing. Does that sound cool? Do you think our culture would like that? That'd be sort of like, as Muslims come out of a mosque, you pass them flyers about Muhammad being a false prophet. That seems really direct and straightforward, doesn't it? Perhaps obnoxious. Doesn't mean you have to be obnoxious, but I'm saying our culture would label it as such. Did the early church do this? Relentlessly they did. He reasoned with them from the Scriptures, verse 2 says. The relentless church is a biblical church. He reasoned with them from the Scriptures. That's the authority, that's the foundation, that's the basis. He's not illogical, he reasoned with them. But what is the foundation? The presuppositional truth is the Scriptures. The relentless church is a biblical church. Verses 3 and 4, what did he do though? Explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead. They're a persuasive church. See, he's explaining. This word literally in Greek means to open. It's as if he's saying, look, Isaiah 53, let me open it up to you in its fullness. Would we be able to witness to someone who said, I'm an Orthodox Jew, show me in my Tanakh, show me this Messiah? Would you know where to go? Psalm 22, Isaiah 53, Genesis 3:15, Genesis 49. There's a lot of places, Isaiah 9, Isaiah 6. Do we know how to open that up? The relentless church must be biblical, and this is in order to be persuasive. Verse 4 says this, and some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas. They became part of the church. They attached themselves. They threw their lot in with these apostles. Immediately, they're added to the number of the relentless church. Now, the Relentless Church in these accounts you're going to see is also a diverse church. That may sound like, oh, we're just throwing in something that's PC to be cool, but watch this. In every one of these passages, you're going to see that it is indeed a diverse church. Verse 4, right after it says some of them were persuaded, as did a great many of the devout Greeks, and not a few of the leading women. So they're in a synagogue. Who's being persuaded? These are Orthodox Jews being persuaded. Not only that, but devout Greeks. That's most likely, it could be God-fearing Gentiles, meaning Gentiles who had sort of bought into some of the truth of Judaism. But it's possible that there's also pagans becoming believers in this. And this makes sense because remember, what city is Paul in? Thessalonica. In 1 Thessalonians 1 through 9, do you remember what he tells them? He says, "For they themselves report concerning us the kind of reception we had among you, and how you turned to God from idols to serve the living and true God." So, devout Greeks, pagan Greeks, devout Jews, and leading women. So, the early church certainly had a lot of poor, uneducated people, but leading women are most likely women who were women of means themselves and probably married to those described as leading men. And the early church had an overabundance of women in its midst. It was an equality in the early church that we see that was not present in the Roman world. The early church, the Relentless Church, is a diverse church. Verse 6 through 9. So they come looking for him, this rabble-rousing mob. They could not find them. They dragged Jason. Some of you guys didn't know the name Jason was in the Bible, did you? It is. It's a Greek way they would often call guys named Joshua. Seeking to bring them out to the crowd. When they couldn't, the city authorities shouting, "These men who have turned the world upside down have come here also." What does that mean? What they're saying is they're disturbing the peace. They're causing civil disorder. The Pax Romana, Rome, known for being a place, an empire that conquers people so then they can live in peace and harmony. That's the idea. They were very concerned with peacefulness and law and all of that. And here comes these people. These folks are telling the Thessalonica authorities, they've done this everywhere else. Now here they are amongst us. So that means, first of all, they had a reputation as being in some kind of rebels against the system. I'm not saying rebels like youth group, hey, Jesus was a rebel and you can be one too. What I mean is they were in a very real, serious way viewed by the authorities and by the people as subversive to the order of the day. And they were. What did they do? Jason has received them, verse 7 says. They are all acting against the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, Jesus. The Relentless Church is viewed as rebellious. The Relentless Church is a Jesus-focused church. Well, what do they mean against Caesar? Well, probably this. Kingdom of God. Messiah. The Jews that bought into the idea of a Messiah coming was troubling to Rome because in their mind they understood the Jews as having a Messiah to beat them up. So you start talking about Messiah, you start talking about kingdoms, you start talking about the parousia, when Jesus comes back and sets everything up, he's the king, a change of authorities. Did you know the Caesars at this time had actually made it illegal to prophesy certain prophecies? Key amongst them was prophesy the changing of kingdoms. You're not allowed to do that. Caesar will fall in 30 days. That was actually illegal. So if you say Jesus is coming back, the King of Kings, that's a problem. But they still proclaimed the same message. They knew this, but they were still relentless. They knew it would be misunderstood. The people in the city authorities were disturbed when they heard these things. Then in verse 9, basically, they have to post bail. They say, look, we're not going to do anything, but you have to not be able to come back. And it seems to bear a witness. If you remember in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, Paul says, I wanted to come see you guys a lot, but Satan hindered us. There was a snare set up. We couldn't do it. This makes sense when you think of what was there. So Paul had to leave this region. Now, he just had come from Philippi. These are all cities in northern Greece. the area called Macedonia. And he was in trouble in Philippi. Then he comes into Thessalonica. So they had already traveled 90 to 100 miles to get here. But then what do? Let's go to the next place. Not take a breather, not rest, not think, we need to change our message, we're getting in trouble everywhere we go. Instead, this relentless church, Paul and Silas being representatives, say, let's go to the next place where we know there's a synagogue, Berea. Acts chapter 17, verses 10 through 15. Berea was about 60 miles west. So they travel 60 miles west. They go to the next Jewish synagogue. Verse 10 says they went into the Jewish synagogue. And the idea in the text seems to be there in verse 10. The way the original wording is they immediately went into. They're literally from one place to the next. I forgot to tell you what that meant. So that means they're intentional. Again, the Relentless Church is an intentional church. They're purposefully going. And in fact, when we get to the end of this account in 17:14, it says, the brothers immediately sent Paul off on his way to the sea. So as soon as they're done in Berea, they go somewhere else. Very intentional in their proclamation of the gospel, wasting no time. The relentless church. Verse 11, the relentless church is an intentional and a biblical church. These Jews were more noble than those in Thessalonica. They received the word with all eagerness, examining the scriptures daily to see if these things were so. Now, if these devout Jews are checking up what Paul and Silas are saying with the scriptures, and it's checking out, as we'll see in the next verse, that means this relentless church is a scripturally based, a Bible church, yet again. And isn't it good? Luke, the author of Acts, doesn't think it's a bad thing that these people are checking up. That means, how do we be good Bereans now in the 21st century? When the preacher preaches, when the man on TV preaches, when the person at your door preaches, when your neighbor preaches their gospel, you examine it daily to see if these things are so. Not just receive the word with all eagerness. That's good. That's a childlike openness to the truth. But also examining, see, that's a close inspection, scriptures daily to see if these things were so. The relentless church is a persuasive church. Verse 12, many of them therefore believed. And watch this, the relentless church is a diverse church, with not a few Greek women of high standing, as well as men. This is sort of like what we just read. There's a pattern here. They didn't get tired of going from town to town, getting kicked out, preaching the gospel from the scriptures, going into synagogues, having people of all types and stripes joining up with them. This is what they did. This is what the church must always do. This is not just some story about heroes doing really cool things a long time ago. This is supposed to be you. If coming here every Sunday and never missing a Sunday is your idea of being a relentless Christian, you don't know what being relentless for the gospel is. The relentless church is a diverse church. The relentless church, according to verse 13, is again viewed as a rebellious church. But when the Jews from Thessalonica, so those same guys over there, they heard about it. They learned that the word of God was proclaimed by Paul at Berea also. So somehow they heard. Someone sent an email, They came the 60 miles as well. They came there too, agitating and stirring up the crowds. Probably saying things very similar. If it worked back there, why not try it again here? Rebellious. But they're also a Jesus-focused church. Now, the word Jesus is not in the text, but as you look at 11, when it says these folks were examining the scriptures to see if these things were so, what do you think they were examining as far as what Paul and Silas were telling them? Like I mentioned earlier, it is necessary that Jesus must suffer and die. Look at Isaiah 53. Look at this person portrayed, the suffering servant. He's not just coming to reign and rule like you thought or you wished or you wanted. He is coming to do something bigger than that, to die for sin, to bear our iniquity, to be crushed on our behalf. Look at this. They examined, are these things so? So they were still a Jesus-focused church. So now at this point, we see verse 14. It says this, your brothers immediately sent Paul off on his way to the sea, but Silas and Timothy remained there. Those who conducted Paul brought him as far as Athens, and after receiving a command for Silas and Timothy to come to him as soon as possible, they departed. At this point, it appears there is no church where Paul is going. There is a synagogue, but Paul is alone. Paul is alone, it seems, at this point, as we go into verses 16 through 21. Now he's in Athens, 300 miles from Berea. So probably by way of sea, don't know for certain. It took a while to get there. And watch Paul's experience, and you'll see these same 6 points about the relentless church that you saw in our previous two cities. Just what you saw in Thessalonica and Berea, you're going to see in Athens. Watch this. Now, while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him as he saw the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons and the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. Some of the Epicurean and the Stoic philosophers also conversed with him, and some said, what does this babbler wish to say? Others said, he seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities, because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. They took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, may we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? For you bring some strange things to our ears. We wish to know, therefore, what these things mean. Now all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there would spend their time in nothing except telling or hearing something new. Paul is in Athens. It's not the city it once was. It's sort of a shadow of its former self. Still a lot of smart people there, or those who deem themselves smart. He looks around and sees art of all kind, but he doesn't just see the artistic beauty, he sees idols to false gods. This is a great place to make practical application for us. First of all, Paul is observing the culture, isn't he? We should observe the culture. What kind of things do they like? This doesn't mean you need to watch every rated R movie or whatever the case is, or buy every crazy album. The point is, there was an observation and understanding of the culture around them. He's looking, he's seeing, what do they like? But he's not captivated by it, is he? He's not thinking, at least it doesn't seem from this, his primary thought is not, wow, look at the craftsmanship on that idol. I'm sure it was beautiful, right? I'm sure they looked, we have some of them today. We know they're pretty cool looking. But he doesn't see that. He sees idolatry. So when you look around, are you enraptured and captured and snared by the culture, saying, oh, I'm studying the culture like Paul, just trying to figure it all out. But are you really swept away, caught away with it? Or is your spirit provoked within you as you see that our culture is filled with idols? Paul was. It's easy to be the new cool Christian, right? I don't live in the suburbs. I'm not white, or at least I wish I wasn't. I understand your pain. I'm very cultured. All of these, check me out. Oh, yeah, I can drink that. I can do that. I can go here. But are you agitated by the idolatry and the culture? Or does that make you sound too serious about your faith? See, when we look at this model, what do we think of them? Honestly, when you're reading this, do you think these people are crazy? Do you think they're insane? Do you think they're fundamentalists? Do you think they're dangerous? Do you think this is not real because no one would do? What do you think? Or do you think, I want to be like that. Help me, Lord, be like that. Or if you're not a believer and you see this, I hope you're thinking, what could compel someone to be this way? What would propel them to think and live like this? Jesus. Look at the relentless church. Intentional. Verse 12. Intentional, verse 12. because Paul was going to Athens right away, and also intentional because look at verse 17. He reasoned in the synagogue. So he's going into the synagogue again. And in the marketplace, verse 17. You see Acts 17:17. So he's intentional. He's going to places where people are ready to talk about these things. He's intentional. And he's biblical. He reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews, and we know how Paul reasons from the Scriptures, and the devout persons, and in the marketplace every day with those who happen to be there. Paul was also persuasive. Now this one, if you look, is all the way in verse 34, the persuasive one. Because at the very end, after Paul does his speech and everything else in Acts 17, here's what it says. Acts 17:34, it says, "But some men joined him and believed, among whom also were Dionysius the Areopagite and a woman named Amarius and others with them." And also, again, you see the diversity. Even in that little list of names, there's some diversity. Again, you see leading women being a key thing. You see Greek guys. But watch this. There's another kind of diversity that the Relentless Church had, and it's this. Paul studied himself to where he could share the gospel in a variety of contexts to a variety of people. Look at this. He reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews. That takes one thing. You better know the Hebrew Scriptures. That's a certain kind of religious mentality. You go in there, you reason with the Jews in the synagogue. And the devout persons. Those are probably the God-fearing Gentiles again. That they're sort of different there. There's some different concerns and needs. And in the marketplace every day. So this is anyone buying some veggies. This is whoever is out there with those who happen to be there. So he's not just with one kind. And then look at this. Some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. Two different kind of philosophers. Epicureans, who seem to be what you might call materialistic deists. That's a short description. Or the Stoics, who were pantheistic rationalists. They all had their own thing. Two different schools of philosophy there in Athens. He's speaking with both of them. And then they call him before the Areopagus, who are composed of philosophers and even people who have some authority in the law of the city. And he speaks to them later on. Diverse in who he approaches. He doesn't just say, I'll just go to this, I'll go to that. There's a diversity there. It doesn't mean he wasn't strategic. He targeted the synagogues, if you notice. But he could speak to all people about all of Jesus. Paul at Athens was still viewed as a problem. Not quite rebellious like in the other things explicitly, but still something strange. Let me show you one that's more implicit. Verse 16, he's agitated about the idolatry of the city. So here's the order of the day. Here's what's accepted. Paul says, this is all wrong. Paul's by himself. He's not even able to turn to Silas and be like, why do they worship this idol? This idol, all this idol wants to do is have sex with your wife. Why would they worship him? This idol's a god of war. Why would they even think that's worthy of worship? They don't, couldn't even do that. He just had to see it. But it's Paul against the culture. Just Paul looking. That is a rebellious, that is subversive in the sense of, here's the culture status quo, here's what Scripture is, I stand against. But yet also, in verses 18 through 20, watch what they say. What does this babbler wish to say? He seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities. Now, on one hand, they like new things, but on the other hand, the Romans more so, especially than the Greeks, but in Roman culture, religions that were new were suspect. The only reason why Rome did not persecute Jews more is because they're like, look, you're wacky with your religion. We don't really understand it. You're fanatical, but it's really old, so we give you some respect. So Rome basically made certain concessions to Judaism. That's why in the beginning of Christianity, there was not a lot of persecution as far as official, because they viewed them just as some stranger Jews than the rest. Once it was clear they were not, they said, wait, you're a new religion. So there's still a subversive, rebellious aspect to Christian belief in the culture, but it's still Jesus-focused. Verse 18, he was preaching Jesus in the resurrection. Preaching as proclamation. Now you can see that he's willing to interact with objections because he's having a discussion, but he is still proclaiming. He's not saying it's more probabilistic that Jesus is the real true God than your other gods. He is telling them that is the truth. He handles objections, he listens to what they have to say, he discusses it, but he is preaching, he is proclaiming, he is declaring, he is heralding Jesus and the resurrection. Now you may say, sometimes there's a tendency to say something like this: if the culture, they don't understand your message, you must be doing something wrong. You just do it this way, I got this other way. Sometimes that's true, right? But Paul was clearly proclaiming Jesus and the resurrection. But what did they say? Verse 18, what does this babbler wish to say? First of all, he's a babbler. He's just talking nonsense, stuff he must have picked up from somewhere else. Wish to say. He can't even say what his stuff that he's ripped off from other people. He can't even articulate clearly. What is he trying to say? Or, well, he seems, they're saying it's still not clear to me, to be a preacher of foreign gods. Gods? Is Paul polytheistic? What? Well, Paul was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. So apparently in their mind, Jesus and anastasis, resurrection, were two gods he was proclaiming. Remember another time where Paul and another early missionary were at another pagan city? They thought that they were gods. So in one case of the pagans, they think they're old gods. Here they think Paul's talking about new gods. They were confused about the message, so Paul elaborates. But even if it is not immediately clear to the culture, and I would say it never will be unless the Lord opens their eyes, and if they do understand it without the Lord opening their eyes, they'll only understand it to hate it. But he doesn't change the focus. He doesn't say, wow, the Jesus focus seems to be getting me in trouble. The resurrection stuff, they don't believe in the resurrection of the body because the Greeks don't value the body. Let me talk about ethical principles. Let me talk about vices. The Stoics don't like vices either. We Christians don't believe in doing this. Oh, that sounds good. Let's just talk about the ethics of... He doesn't just do that, does he? See, the relentless church may be misunderstood, but the church has no other option but to be relentless. What is relentless? I've been using that word the whole time, right? But what does it actually mean? Well, you can open up the dictionary, you could do this. There's all kinds of things you could do. But in John Calvin's commentary on Acts 17, he says something really cool about Paul that I think encapsulates what it means to be relentless. Here's what he says. Paul had, quote, unconquerable mental courage and indefatigable endurance of the cross. Indefatigable. If you hear that word fatigue, it just means never get tired of it. Unconquerable mental courage and indefatigable endurance of the cross. That's a good definition for relentless. In the beginning I read the account of the persecution at Lyons in southern France when the Christians are getting killed, and yet during the whole time they're telling people, we're Christians, we're not going to relent. You fast forward half a century to a man named Tertullian writing in sometime between 160 and 240, that's his birth and death date. And listen to what Tertullian says to the pagans. He almost says it in a church triumphant kind of way about what has happened, even with all the persecution. And he's writing from North Africa. Listen to what he says. We are but of yesterday, and we have filled every place among you. Cities, islands, fortresses, towns, marketplaces, the very camp, tribes, companies, palace, senate, forum. We have left nothing to you but the temples of your gods. We are but of yesterday, and we have filled every place among you. Even while they're being killed. That is a relentless church. Now, I hinted toward this earlier. Go to the last slide if you could, please. Let's individualize this. We're talking about the church. The church is comprised of those who are the elect, but sometimes it's easy to think of, well, that means as long as some Christians are doing that, then I'm like part of it. What about getting specific? The relentless Christian is an intentional Christian. This means you, if you're a Christian, go out of your way, inconvenience yourself to share the gospel. Not just when it's fun or easy or someone says, why do you smile so much? That's good. I hope you do smile so much. But we're talking about intentionality. Going into places, maybe even where you know you are not welcome because the gospel is not welcome. Intentional. Maybe that means going online to the LDS website, requesting a Book of Mormon, and then when it says, would you like missionaries to hand deliver it to you? You check yes. And then you know some missionaries are coming to you, so you should be ready. That's called intentionality. Maybe you should do that. It works. The intentional Christian. Are you an intentional Christian? The biblical Christian, those Bereans studied the scriptures every day and they checked what was said. They checked up daily. So just going out with a lot of zeal and righteousness and you're going to tell the world without being like a Berean, you have nothing to offer. I'm not saying that you need to be an expert in theology to witness, because these early Christians, as soon as they were saved, they were going. But you better start. You can't be a relentless Christian without being a biblical Christian. And by the way, if you're not a relentless Christian and you wonder why, it's probably because you're not really a biblical Christian. A persuasive Christian. This doesn't mean you use tricks. Let's turn on the lights, let's get the smoke, let's play the organ, come now. Or anything like that. The message is still clear. Why is it persuasive? The Holy Spirit is the one who opens the heart, opens the eyes. But Paul is using reason. He's not using bad arguments. He's not saying, just believe. It feels good. He used logic and truth from the Scripture. The intentional Christian is a diverse Christian. All people, all of Jesus. Sometimes it's easy to be in the inner city and talk or mock about suburban churches. Do you witness to people in the suburbs? Do the suburbs need Jesus, or is it just people in the inner city? A diverse Christian, meaning you're willing to talk to all people at all times, no matter what. And you understand the gospel is for all of them. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to have a quota of how many friends of each type you have. In certain locales, that's difficult. But there's ways to do it. I'll stop there with that one. We got to move on. A rebellious Christian. Again, this doesn't mean that, you ride a Harley, have a black leather jacket, smoke cigarettes, and, play rock and roll, right? That's kind of an old picture of a rebel. But that's not what it means. It's saying that certain things you believe, do, hold to, say, will be viewed because they are subversive to the system. The system doesn't like that. So when someone says, that's hateful, that's wicked, that's evil, that's dangerous, because it's going against everything the culture says. Christianity must do so at certain points. Sure, there's certain points of contact with truth with almost any culture, but there's going to be always something that rubs the culture the wrong way. So just because you make people mad doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. It may be. Maybe you're a jerk and you think that being rude is one of the fruit of the Spirit. It's not. But just because someone is mad at you doesn't mean you did something wrong. Were they mad at them? Were they beating them up? Were they throwing them in jail? Were they Yes, they were. Jesus focused. Jesus and the resurrection. Anything else is not the gospel. Now, if you're not a Christian here and you're hearing about this, you're like, well, this doesn't apply to me. I don't need to go witness, share this gospel thing. I'm not even saved anyway. I'm just here because I'm here, whatever. Or I don't even... Here is the gospel. It's going to be focused on Jesus and the resurrection. Sin is a problem that we all have. It needs a solution. God has, in His gracious mercy, sent a solution to the person of Jesus Christ. So, the just, wrathful punishment of death that every single person in this room deserves was absorbed by the sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross. That means He paid the penalty for your sins. But death didn't conquer him. It could not conquer the one who was the God-man. It could not conquer the second person of the triune God in flesh. He rose again on the third day. That means he is King of kings, Lord of lords over all. That means everything he said is true. That means if you are in him, you will also one day receive a resurrection body, which is one reason why these early Christians didn't have to be so scared or worried about death.